Hello, I heard from many of you that you struggle with middle games. In this video you will see 10 tips from a 2300 rated player that will make you so much better at chess. The primary thing is having a plan. Your every move needs to have a purpose. You cannot just move a pawn somewhere there, because it doesn't make sense. In this position I play knight e1 because I want to move it to d3 and cover the c5 square. I also don't want to lose a tempo when black pawn plays to g4. However, the plans can change. In this position you can just decide to block the king side first to avoid any attacks on your king. g4, knight f6, f3, h5 and h3. And now the king side is blocked. King f7, you will play king f2, rook h8, trade the rooks and continue with the plan. So remember, plans can change and just always seek for new opportunity. Keep your pieces together and make sure that they all have a purpose. In this case, white's plan is to attack the weaknesses on a6 and c6. The queen is attacking both pawns. This knight is attacking the bishop that is protecting the pawn. This knight is attacking the bishop and the pawn. And this rook will also attack it once the knights trade. So in this case, black doesn't have anything good to play. They play h6 and we play takes, takes and takes. And we have a pawn and we will easily win the game. Do you see how isolated the bishop on b5 is? It's not protected by anything and it's just vulnerable to some attacks. Now white should just play c3 and make the space for the bishop, or just trade the bishop for a knight. White plays queen e2 to try to connect the rooks. However, after queen e2 there is knight d4, a double attack. The queen needs to run away, for example to g4, and black captures the bishop on b5 and wins the game. You have so much time, you don't need to rush and attack the opponent. Instead, just slowly improve your position, put every piece into the game and then attack. So my student played d4. This pawn isn't well defended because of the bishop. The opponent took, he took, and knight e4. The opponent took a pawn and we cannot take there because then they take our knight and we are down a pawn. So instead white need to take the knight. Knight takes c3, knight d8, knight d1, knight b7, bishop b7. And what's the outcome? Well, the bishop is pinned to b2 and it cannot be developed. And also it blocks our rook, so we have only one rook on d1 in the game. Instead of playing d4, he should prepare and develop the bishop on e3. The opponent would also develop the bishop. And again, before moving the pawn, we can play h3 to avoid knight g4. The opponent played rook e8 and now we can counter in the center, d4, c takes d and knight takes d4. They traded and we end up with a nice bishop, a semi-open file which allows us to attack the d6 pawn, a very strong d5 square, and just loads of plan to make. I hope you understood that you have loads of time in middle game, especially in closed positions like this. So after we think about this position, we can see a very strong d5 square. Obviously we can just jump in with our knight. However, after we do this, the knights will trade and create double pawns, blocking our bishop. So we want to jump into the d5 square, however we don't want to take the piece back with our pawn. So we will make a maneuver. Knight e1. This knight is going to d5. As we can see, black just creates some space with the pawns, however we continue with the plan. After b4 we play knight d5. We trade and we take with the knight. Obviously they will want to get rid of the knight by bishop b7 and we cannot do much about that. We play bishop e3, they take, knight b5 and a4. Eventually the position will open up and eventually we will have a pair of bishops which will be better for us. So always connect your rooks. What I mean by this? You want to get rid of the bishop, knight and queen in this case. We play bishop f4, c5, c3, knight d2, queen b6 and queen b3. Now the rooks are able to open lines, are lines without pawns on them. So how to fight for them? Well, we can just trade one of the rooks and then replace it with another one. We can also double up the rooks on an open file, which increases the power of our pieces. So now both rooks are attacking the e8 square. If the rooks trade, we still remain controlling the line. Open lines often have very strong squares defended by the pawns. They are ideal for knights. If the knight jumps onto the square, we can see that it attacks many squares. Even if it is traded, we can replace it with the rook, and if it is traded, we can replace it with the bishop, and now the bishop is very, very strong. Exchange your worse pieces for the opponent's better ones. In this position, a great example is trading our knight for the bishop on e3. Now we wait until white attacks our knight, and they play f3. We tried, and do you see how many weak black squares are there? We have a black square bishop, and we will be able to use it and control the board. But why do we even want to trade it? First of all, it's a bishop, and if we have a pair of bishops, we'll have better endgame. And also, look at this bishop. It's shooting at both diagonals. It's very strong. It disables many squares, many important squares, and is able to fight anywhere it needs to. Do you see how many weak black squares are there? We have a black square bishop, and we will be able to use it and control the board. Every pawn move creates a weakness somewhere else. If we move this pawn from a7 to a6, b6 became very weak, and this might be exploited by knight a4 and maybe bishop b6 in the future. If they move to a5, they don't protect b5. If they move to b6, they don't protect a6, and this might be a huge weakness. So really think about pawn moves. So instead of moving your pawns, really focus on your pieces, improve their positions, and then push your pawns. You always need to support your pawns with the pieces. And the best support is the rook. And if they play a3, we play b4, and we have a very nice developed rook. Keep your king safe. Don't push your king pawns when you have no piece around the king. I understand h3 because you win a tempo and you create a space for the king and avoid the backrank mate. Now white played g4. Black took, pawn took, and white played king bishop e3 to avoid knight d4, queen d7, king g2, rook f8, rook h1, and f5. They took, queen took. Now white didn't see that they can protect the knight, and they played knight d5. So they just traded, won queen, and won the game. Even if black didn't take the pawn, white is still in trouble. Bishop e3, h5, g5 to push the pawn to protected square, knight h7, and h4. Do you see how many moves white wasted on making their king weak? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 moves wasted. What could they play instead? I don't know, queen e2, rook d1, rook e1, and d4. Isn't it better? During the middle game, I already want you to think about endgame. Think about the pawn structure, activity of your king. If you are up in material, you should always go into an endgame. Black's pawns are very weak. The kings are equal. Black has bishops, a pair of bishops. However, the position is closed, and they can't really do much. But our knights can jump to squares like f5 or a5, and they can harass the weaknesses. I can't really lose this position, but I can win. So go for it and just try your best.